Ready to start. Okay, just going. Hi everyone, glad to see you all here. This week we've got Vaibhav giving a talk on why is the world so unequal. It's going to be a really interesting talk. Glad to see you here, and without any further ado, here's Vaibhav.
Hello everyone. In today's presentation, I'll try and address the question, why is the world so unequal? Firstly, there are many different types of inequality, and for the purpose of this talk, I'll be focusing on inequality between different regions in the world. To begin with, I'll explore the historic roots of regional inequality and examine the impacts of a few key events that have had a significant effect on inequality. We may think that inequality has always existed, however, this was not the case historically. While inequality within societies dates back to ancient times, with institutions set up to keep a rigid social hierarchy, such as the feudal system in Europe, where the people at the top have vastly more resources than those at the bottom, inequality between societies was actually very small. The main reason for this was that economic growth was very slow and roughly uniform around the world. The lives of people, generation after generation, was very similar, which may seem illogical to us from a modern perspective, as our lives are vastly different to those living in the 20th century. However, the life of a farmer living in the 12th century would almost be identical to one living in the 13th century, which would also be very similar to one living in the 14th century. This illustrates a distinct lack of economic progress. If we look at the production possibility frontier for these historic economies, in order to achieve economic growth, to go from an inefficient combination to a productively efficient one, the factors of production need to be organized more efficiently. While some of this did happen, there was very little advances in governance institutions, and hence the factors of production were utilized quite similarly, generation to generation. For example, a father taught his sons the farming techniques that he learned from his own father, and generation after generation used essentially the same methods. Additionally, there was very little advancement in the quality or quantity of factors of production, and hence the PPF remained relatively static. And this was true for societies across the world. Also, something to keep in mind was that the overwhelming majority of people at this time lived in poverty. This all changed, however, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, which marked the start of rapid economic growth. During the Industrial Revolution, the production of goods was transitioned from fully handmade to machine manufactured, representing a massive increase in the efficiency of resources, as well as facilitating the growth of capital stocks. Simultaneously, merchants became more involved in supplying goods, employing workers, and paying wages, etc., which contributed to the development of capitalism. However, the industrial and capitalist revolution didn't occur at the same time across the world. It happened first in Britain, followed by the rest of Europe. This meant that the industrialized regions had a massive economic head start over their non-industrial neighbors. Industrial countries used their economic advantage, amongst many other things, such as better weaponry and naval strength, in order to colonize other regions, and it would be irresponsible not to look at the economic effect this had. As from my research, colonization was the most important historic cause for the inequality we see today. Oversimplified for the purpose of this talk, colonization involved one country, the colonizer, taking over another, called the colony, and forcefully taking their natural resources and controlling their native population, often subjecting them to forced labor and slavery. Colonization not only helped the colonizer greatly, but also greatly hindered the colony itself, as resources, both labor and goods, were forcefully stripped from the colony, who didn't receive adequate payment, if any, and brought into the colonizer's economy. The colony had their factors of production stripped from them, from raw materials to labor, meaning the economy actually contracted. Meanwhile, the colonizer had an equivalent expansion. To put the scale of the impact of colonization into perspective, economists have estimated that Britain took over $45 trillion worth from India in specific, over a time span of 173 years, which is over 15 times India's GDP in 2019. Furthermore, the way colonizer countries invested their new wealth, which was into improving education and healthcare, provided long-term returns on investment, initially providing them with a more efficient labor force, but later down the line, attracting the smartest young minds to come study in them. All in all, the 17th century with the Industrial Revolution and capitalism marked the start of regional inequality, with colonization launching Europe on a steep upward trajectory, while launching other regions on a downwards one. From a historic factor to one that very much still exists now, the form of governance and the quality of a country's institutions has a massive impact on its economic health. In the long run, democracies tend to do much better than dictatorships, mainly because in a functioning democracy with a free press, the government is obliged to make decisions with the interest of its population in mind, as if they do otherwise, they are highly unlikely to get re-elected. In contrast to this, dictators know that they will remain in power as long as they keep their military happy, and therefore factor the welfare of their citizens much less into consideration when making decisions. In addition to the form of governance, the effectivity of institutions plays a massive role in the inequality we see today. In general, wealthier countries have been found to be much less corrupt than poorer countries, with it not being uncommon for politicians to artificially make waiting times longer than necessary for legal proceedings, such as buying a house or starting a business, in hopes of receiving bribes to speed up the process. Furthermore, institutions such as the police and law courts tend to be much weaker in poorer countries as a result of underfunding, leading to the population having to take precautions before entering agreements. In these scenarios, people only enter agreements if at every stage of the agreed course of action, it is in everyone's interest to keep their word, and if each party believes that the other parties will keep their word. So both of these conditions need to be met before people enter agreements. People also have to resort to social stigma and societal norms in order to increase the opportunity cost of breaking agreements. However, these methods are often much less effective than having a well-formed law and order system. Also, it limits agreements within smaller communities in poorer nations, where people can only trade with those who they know personally. Meanwhile, thanks to our well-developed banking institutions in richer countries, people can withdraw loans from millions of people's money. If you would like to learn more about the specifics of this topic of trading in poorer countries, you could read chapters 2 and 3 of a very short introduction to economics, where it's explained in much greater depth. But to summarize the information there, richer countries can allocate their resources much more efficiently than poorer countries due to better institutions, which helps them achieve more economic growth. Finally, I'd like to discuss potential solutions to the problem of inequality. Firstly, I'll present two basic approaches and then open it up to any thoughts. Firstly, I think a significant amount needs to be invested in poorer countries if they're to achieve the rapid development required to catch up to more wealthy countries. And these investment schemes can be split up into two categories, top-down and bottom-up schemes. Bottom-up schemes have the advantage of involving local population more heavily, but have a smaller impact. Meanwhile, top-down schemes involve large government schemes that can have a wide-ranging reach, but suffer from high costs and are susceptible to corruption. Thank you for listening to my talk today on inequality. I'll open it up to any questions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the final question of solving inequality.
Thank you, Viraj. Great talk. So just if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand, type it in the chat, or just unmute themselves. And yeah, thank you, Viraj. Vaibhav. Sorry.
So Strays put, do you think the colonizer should pay compensation? I think ideally, from an ethical perspective, it would be, I think they should, but I don't see how that would be feasible to enforce colonizer countries to pay compensation. Like economically, I don't see how that would happen. Although from like an ethical perspective, I think they should. Amishi said, is it possible to solve inequality realistically? I was looking into this when I was finishing off the talk to try and find solutions to it, and I'm a bit at odds. I'm not too sure about that question because while I'd love to say it's possible and hopefully in the long term it's possible, in the short term I think it would be a very tough challenge to solve. Neil also said, isn't inequality caused a lot by the fact we live in a society in which having capital generates more capital, which means the richer get richer and the poorer gets poorer? Wouldn't it be better to have a solution where we organize everything where this isn't the case? That's a very good point, and I would have to agree with you because after colonization, the colonizer countries had a lot more capital, and then they built upon it. So they built better education and healthcare systems, which gave them much better returns on investment. And then they went from strength to strength. But I'm not sure how you would organize it in a way where having more capital, where having more capital doesn't generate more riches. Because before capitalism, everyone was poor, and I don't think I don't think we should try and return to that. So I think Zach's question builds on that. Do you think you can solve inequality and have capitalism? That's a very tough question. I'm not too sure on that one. I feel like there has to be a solution, but I wasn't able to find it while researching. Inequality is bad, it's excessive. I think that inequality of opportunity is very bad. So the life of an identical person living in a poor country in comparison to a rich country, their life prospects are very different, and I think that's very bad and unfair because we can't control which country you were born in. But just to add to that, if the opportunities available are quite comparable, then perhaps inequality isn't as bad because it's down to the person's own actions and stuff. Um, your question, Amisha, is a very interesting one. Poor countries usually work in primary sectors, which we need. I mean, you make a good argument that inequality is needed, but I feel like manufacturing doesn't need to be for poor countries where with automation and that kind of stuff, I feel like richer countries can also expand manufacturing. And if we just leave manufacturing to poorer countries, we bring human worker rights issues such as like sweatshops and child labor and that kind of stuff arises. We have to put an end to that. And if poorer countries with lower regulations are forced into manufacturing and there's no other choice for people there, then that's a bad thing. Matthew, your question about inequality being unavoidable due to different geographic conditions. I feel like that was much less important because prior to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, although there was inequality between regions, it was much less than now. So now inequality is massive. But I think stats are really like mind blowing. Like we don't realize how bad it is right now. But like a certain base level of inequality might be unavoidable, but the levels we have now are definitely avoidable. Capitalism helped us to progress technology, will turn down our capitalist society, socialized solution. Um, I feel like capitalism has been very beneficial to us because prior to that, everyone was much poorer than they are now. But to your question on will socializing more firms help? I feel like it will help with solving inequality, but it might slow down the rate of progression. So technology and that kind of stuff might progress less by doing that. But I don't know if it's worth. I don't know if it's worth it. That's like an ethical point. Yeah, sure. I think your point on improving inequality within countries will help a lot. I thought it would be a bit too wide of a topic to go into like, too much in this talk because I wanted to focus on inequality between regions, but for sure, solving inequality within countries will help, especially because in poorer countries, lots of the wealth is in with lots of the wealth is in the hands of a few people who tend to be more corrupt, and if that was solved, then inequality would be much less. I think it would be a step in the right direction if banks took inequality into consideration, but I don't really know the arguments against it. But maybe they might have put forward some good arguments against it. If you know like any of the arguments they put forward, please put it in the chat, please.
I think it's also a time we're going to do breakout rooms for about 5 minutes just to see what how start discussion, get going, see what people think of solutions to inequality. So I'm going to start breakout rooms now. We can go discuss solutions about inequality, and then we can come back and Vaibhav can answer any questions you have about inequality and then end the discussion there. So yeah. Okay, so I think we all made it back. Yeah, I was in one breakout room. There's a really good discussion going on. Just wanted to say what they were talking about, what opinions and thoughts they came up with.
So we were talking about how the major bodies like international organizations like the UN, IMF, the World Bank, they could try and like get richer countries to tax big corporations and then use the money from big corporations to basically fund investment schemes in hospitals, schools, all that good stuff.
Wait, Matthew, just to like clarify the format, do I respond to like what people say?
Yeah, you or anyone else just has any thoughts on what Shrey said? So what Shrey's saying about the major organizations funding lower down, that would definitely be something useful that they should do. But obviously at the time they don't do much of that, and there is an increasing like call for them to start. But ultimately the question is why don't you think they're doing that?
So do you mean like they should get taxed in poorer countries so when they manufacture that?
Well, I don't know what Shrey meant. Shrey, what did you mean by that?
So like if a British listed company, I can't think of an example, but something that is taxed in the UK, pays corporation tax in the UK, if they say produce their goods in I don't know, India or China, like they could, I don't know how to describe it. There could be like a tax sharing scheme. So instead of, I'm not like a lot of corporations don't pay tax in the lower income countries, and I guess it's trying to force corporations to pay fair taxes within the different countries, so that the countries benefit from those big global corporations building factories there.
So just to clarify, do you mean like they should get taxed for goods they sell in, say, Britain, but some of that tax should go to the poorer countries where it's manufactured?
Not really, because that wouldn't be feasible. I was thinking because
Yeah,
like many global corporations, like if say they produce stuff in India or something like that, they'll pay minimum tax within India, but they might pay full tax in Britain. So something like that, like trying to make sure that the basically internationally trying to make corporations pay taxes where they're producing the goods rather than where they're selling them.
yeah, I think the problem with that is like, say the Indian government, they might give like big companies tax breaks in order to attract them to India, and then they like factor in like more jobs and stuff as a benefit. So in order to like prevent them going to a different country.
Yeah, definitely, especially if there's like just lower corporation tax areas, countries, they'd be more attracted towards there anyway. So if you were to make a law where it forces them to pay the high tax in that country, they would just start moving around, or they just leave that country, which would just lead to a greater loss in work and probably grow the inequality even more.
Yeah.
I think it's almost time to end the meeting today, so I'm just going to end the recording. And